I am so excited to be able to talk with you all today. I want to start out just saying that I'm excited because my entry point to this conversation is always as a Black mother to two wonderful Black boys. And my research is in the school to prison pipeline, right? And the impact specifically on Black boys. Excited to be able to sit, in the opposite end spaces where we have, Black men with doctorate degrees who have been educational thought leaders and school leaders, and just really excited to be able to pick your brain and talk about, technology, leadership, equity, all these things that are impacting our day-to-day work. Love to start out knowing, how do you all know each other? For how long? Tell us a little bit about that.
Actually came together after the state of Georgia decided to move forward with creating a chief turnaround office for the state of Georgia. And Dr. Eric Thomas was leading that initiative. And if I'm remembering correctly, Dr. Clay was one of the first hires in that role. And then I think one other person, and then me, to support that initiative, transforming the lowest performing schools in some of the most historic, marginalized, neglected districts.
Darren, I've got to absolutely add this piece because me and Darren actually met prior to our work at the Department of Ed in Georgia. Hopefully you're okay with me sharing this story. We're at UVA. I was the chief support officer there, and Darren was a principal, or I think assistant, at one of the schools in the county, and we were partnering. And Darren, am I correct? You got like a call for an interview? Does that sound right?
Yep.
And it was over the summer, and I don't know if you knew you might get an interview, but he didn't have a shirt and tie. So somehow he asked me, and I didn't know who's this Darren Clay guy, but he asked me, did I have a shirt and tie? I went back to my room. I don't know if it was the same day or the next day. I decked him out, shirt, tie. I think I even gave you a jacket.
Yeah, you gave me all three.
The question is, did you get them back, Dr. Thomas?
Actually, I'm gonna have to let me go and check on that. No, but nice. Terriana, that's how the three of us met. Some absolutely fantastic work in Georgia. The outcomes there were absolutely phenomenal, and Darren and Dwight played such an incredible role with that. So yeah, that's how the three of us came together.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I appreciate the story too. See, you all still have some jackets and ties now. I would love to kind of dive in a little bit more. I think you're talking about outcomes and our most marginalized, youth. And I want to bring us to equity, right? And I think equity is a hot topic right now. It has been even more so over the last couple of those of us who are leading schools and leading districts. Tell me about equity-based leadership, right? Like, what does it mean when equity is the foundation of the way that you lead?
Okay, anyway, so I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that question, Terriana, just simply because this is the root of our work, particularly my work, where I'm having conversations with system level leaders, and they're like, well, I'm really interested in diving deeper into DEI work. And in some places it's JEDI work, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice included. And my response is always the same. I said, if you're looking for a sit and get, you're looking for the wrong person. You're looking for the wrong organization. When we start to talk about equity, we're talking about different ways of thinking, and that's not a sit and get. And in order for system level leaders, or just leaders in general, like teacher leaders, school leaders, district leaders, it doesn't matter. If you're really concerned about learning outcomes for historically marginalized, for all students, but particularly historically marginalized students in marginalized communities, equity is the foundation of every decision you make as a leader. And it's not a sit and get. It's not, well, so how do we incorporate equity into our curriculum? That's the wrong question, because you're not using equity as the foundation. for all of the work. And I know that's not really a definition, but that is more so putting it in practice. And that's really what we do. And we're not theorizing anything here. We're actually talking about how do we have pragmatic learning outcomes for in ways that are equitable. And the only way to do that, and there is research to support this, the leader has to make, and the leadership team has to be on board with using or sitting, positing itself with the equity. And every decision is rooted from there. And it's not a sit and get.
Ariana, I would add one piece to that, and Dwight, again, obviously you're like spot on there. The two pieces that I would quickly add to that is, I've seen a lot of experiences where there's a lot of conversation around equity, and there may be a equity director or equity office, or there's a little budget around equity. But in my mind, the hard work is executing on that, actually making decisions, looking at policy, actually driving work of a school or a district with an equity lens, and not just sort of doing the political, we got an equity office. And probably the best example I would give around that is really around staffing. If you've got low performing schools, in my mind, we need to create some structure to encourage, incentivize, inspire our best teachers and our best leaders to want to go to that school. I'm not an advocate of placing anyone at a particular school, but somehow we've got to inspire our best teachers, our best leaders to go to the schools that need them the most. To me, that would be a demonstration of equity.
Oh, and Dr. Thomas, not to take up the space, definitely want to hear from Dr. Clay as well, to really bring home a really important point of creating an effective teacher pipeline for students and the teachers or learning facilitators who serve them. And so that system is really important if we're going to get if we're going to get teachers, learning facilitators who look like and understand what our students are navigating in their lives in a more empathetic way. We have to have the systems in place. And there's work that's being done on a national level that's actually coming from organically, really grassroots movements in communities that are saying, hey, we have students who are graduating from our high schools in these small rural towns or predominantly of color towns, but yet they leave. And they go, if they go into teaching, they don't come back to those areas. So the system then is to create that pipeline that will allow students to transition from being a student to a practitioner of education that understands the needs very specifically of that community, of their community. And that's enough. That's what 3 examples right now of what does equity mean for this work.
And I can just add one piece about the teacher pipeline concept, because I think one of the things that we've seen thus far, post-pandemic and throughout the pandemic, is this idea of a teacher lottery where, you think of a fourth grade hall, and, let's say there's 5 fourth grade teachers. From a technology perspective, all of those teachers may not be equipped to be good technologists and have the competencies needed to design a lesson that requires technology integration at a high level. So we're seeing, in addition to the, just hitting on the equity piece, in addition to the pipeline for just strong instruction and strong leadership, there's also needing to be a point in the conversation that speaks to being able to lead through a technology-rich environment. So there's that caveat to the equity conversation, because we also have situations where students in teacher A's class are having rich asynchronous activities while students in teacher B's class, when they go home, they don't do anything engaging because the teacher create the space or the environment for a technology enhanced activity post lesson. So I think that's an important thing to consider as we're thinking about, equity in today's day and age.
Yeah, I really appreciate that push there to think about technology and how it's at play in our conversation and our work. For my seat, it's been interesting because, this is such a tech heavy generation. The pandemic really forced us into more digital literacies. And as we kind of come out of the pandemic, I'm really interested in how you're thinking about the impact of technology. What should we be doing with our kids to continue to hold sacred what we learned in the pandemic?
I think there's a couple of things, and I think as if we look at it holistically, we gotta look at the continuum between passive use of technology versus active use of technology, and it's two totally different things. Passive, for example, may be a teacher, telling a student to go to a website and what we call drill and skill, right? They just have drill and practice. They're going to this website, doing some math problems. There's a game at the end. That's passive use. The student is not necessarily having to collaborate. They're not using 21st century learning skills. They're not having to self-regulate their learning. And then on the other end of that spectrum, you have active use where students are actually creating digital products. Totally different experience, right? And we got to think about what the outcome and the expectation is going to be for students post-secondary education in the workforce. Right now, if you go to corporate America and you go to the office, there may be 2 people, 4 people at home. They're all working on the same project. They have to collaborate. They have to, update each other on the progress document. They have to share files. They have to chat about the files. They have to add commentary. That's very different from going to a website and saying that you integrated technology. So I think the conversation needs to be looking at the continuum. We create more active use of technology and leveraging, the resource and software that's out there to create that space. But it comes with instructional design, and not to use an old saying, but you think about universal design and understanding by design. It's the concept of designing for every learner and beginning with the end in mind. I think that's important to consider those things.
Someone else want to jump in? I see some nods.
Terriana, I think the piece that I would add to that, I was having conversation, I guess right before the break, and was really trying to get a group of leaders, school leaders, to think about, this kind of a summer slide, where kids over the course of 2 or 3 months, because they're not inundated with learning opportunities, they go backwards. And the point that I was making is that over Thanksgiving break, and it may be 2, 3, or 4 days, that's a slide. You've got Christmas coming up. Students may be out for 2 weeks. That's a slide. So no matter what the great work that's happening sort of face-to-face, student to teacher in a normal classroom setting, kids end up going backwards. How do we leverage technology 3 days over Thanksgiving break? How do we leverage technology over the 2 weeks over Christmas break, so that we don't have kids in these situations are already behind, literally get farther behind. So when I think of, learning loss, when I think of the pandemic, I really appreciate Dwight's point. We really should be thinking about reimagining what school looks like. And I think technology can be a huge piece to that. So that's what comes to mind for me.
Some question, and it's just
Come
what
on.
I got, as I think about like my seat and my work and my boys, what is the balance, right? Between I want to use technology over break to counter learning loss. I want to do that in a way that is active, right? Not passive. And it's like ever prominent cry of like being well, right? And having time to like be present for your family, right? How, when we think about our and our children navigate that. I will preface this by saying my son, my oldest in the pandemic, has been very clear around like when I'm at school, I'm at school. And when I'm at home being a brother, being a son, right? And so how do you navigate all of those things? Because I think the pandemic changed us.
Mhm.
Challenge for you all.
Yeah. Whew. Yeah, that's a lot. And it's loaded. Wow. And that's
Actually, hey, Dwight,
yes.
Darren's our in-house expert. Talk to us, Darren.
Yes, so I think about that. So right now, the conversation, that a lot of educational technologists are having is around time and space of learning, right? And if you think that as a T-chart, you have space and time, and then you have, asynchronous versus synchronous, and then you have to think about that learning. Now, what happens at home, I think, is ultimately triggered by the pathway for success or standard for that particular learning outcome, or the student learning objective per se. All that to say, just to bring a common example, you may have a playlist of activities for students to quote unquote master that standard concept, etc. I think the more and more activities of a given playlist that are deemed a digital version of busy work, that does get left to the side, and it does become non-eventful for a student, and they could be in a situation where they feel obligated to do some work at home, but it may not be as engaging as it could be due to the original design, or the misguided intent of that particular set of activities. So all that to say, I think to help combat that, a part of the conversation has to be, what are the skills needed to complete this task? The skills don't require skills that we are currently solving for, collaboration, critical thinking skills. If the tasks don't require those skills, to me, that's a red flag for that particular activity or sets of activities. So if you find yourself, with your son with activities that are just, reinforcement activity after reinforcement activity, and not a activity that requires some of our, higher order thinking skills, to me, that is a sign that the technology may be misused in that case, unfortunately, and not used to.
I think the only thing that I would add to this piece of the conversation is I think there's such an incredible opportunity. Again, as Dwight talked about ESSER dollars, as we talked about kids having devices, kids are a little bit more in tune with technology and sort of virtual opportunities. How do we engage with teachers that becomes a part of their repertoire at a level that it's engaging, whether it's in class or out of class? For some of our veteran teachers, that's a stretch. But I think just as we expect kids to learn new information and professional development and professional learning opportunities for teachers, I think we've got to provide teachers the opportunity to grow in that area so that they can better engage kids.
I don't want us to lose sight of like our context that we're in right now, right? Like we are leading in a time that has never happened for us before. And the whole world has changed in the last 2 years. And so all the things that we're talking about is like, what do you want us to understand about what it means to lead right now? What should our leaders be thinking about? How is leadership come into play in this really pivotal time in our country's history? Maybe Eric, can you start?
Definitely. Actually, I think a powerful question, a really powerful question. And I'll speak on it sort of using a couple quotes. And Darren and Dwight are familiar with one of them. But the first one, and I actually don't even know who said it, but I read it in Forbes magazine in the middle of the pandemic. And I can't quote it exactly, that crises are alike electricity for innovation. And when you think about the pandemic, you think about the fact that kids were at home for whatever amount of time, that you really can take advantage of this opportunity. Also take advantage of the, we talked about ESSER funds. How do we take advantage of that? So how do we leverage this crisis to do something different, to do something special, and really look at it as an opportunity? So that's one sort of quote. And then the other quote is by Edward Deming. And Deming highlights that organization does to get the results that it gets. And when you think about that, if you're getting results, well, your organization are designed to get those results. And if those results are good and you feel really good about them, maybe there's a tweak here and a tweak there, but in general, you're going in the right direction. But if those results are not where you want them to be, then the answer really is you have to look at your organization. What do you need to do differently? What do you need to change? I think the leader, those are the two things in this space that I really sort of push from to the school leaders and district leaders and thinking about how do we leverage this time and how do we reorganize, how do we reimagine our system to get better results. And then the third thing that I would say is this idea of collective impact. I think anyone who's been a teacher, anyone who's been a building leader, I truly think being a teacher is the hardest, literally, it may be the hardest job on the planet. I've never been a surgeon. I don't know what a biochemist or biotechnologist does, so I don't exactly know that. I know what it's like to teach. And when you've got a class of 25, 30 kids and they're all across the spectrum, the continuum, that's incredibly hard work. And with that lens, that means we've got to bring parents to the table, we've got to bring teachers to the table, we've got to bring principals, community leaders. It's an all hands on deck approach that's needed. And I think if we're really going to do something special to impact kids, it has to be an all hands on deck collective impact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I also have a reflection on that as well, because going back to the quote around innovation, I think, leaders have been tapped to innovate their processes the last couple of years, right? When you think about traditional paper and pencil processes, traditional meeting formats, parent meetings, all that changed over the last 2 or 3 years. Some have argued we've advanced as a country 10 years in terms of digital transformation. We advanced 10 years worth of transformation in a 2-year period. You think of from a family perspective, we digital birthday parties with grandparents and granduncles and cousins and, families. So that itself is just one example, but particularly in the classroom at the district level, a lot of conversation. How do we decipher between keeping what was good practice and also retaining what we learned was better practice in some scenarios, right? For different workflows and different ways that we do work and different ways that we instruct students. So I think as leaders continue that conversation and they continue to reflect on what went well and what they learned from during this period of innovation, I think to me, the conversation has to come back to data, right? Whether that's data from assessments, whether that's data from drill and practice, which we talked about earlier, whether that's data from social emotional learning, because we've seen a huge increase in that. And like, how do we systematic way, in a faster way, is what teachers ask for. The number one issue that teachers have is they don't have time to do everything they need to do. So how do we take all of these data components and create a system where it can be actionable, and that way the leader knows where to prioritize support and to hone in on teacher, he or she can support create that environment for personalized learning. I think that's important.
Mhm. All right. You want to bring us home? What you got? I feel like the data was like, pitched it to you. This is your thing. You got it.
I love that. I absolutely love that, Darren. And I also have to say that if we are going to think more deeply, no, let me rephrase that. Not if. It is absolutely the thing that we have to do. It's not an if situation. We have to think differently about how we are creating the spaces, the equitable spaces for our students to learn. And yeah, there's this overwhelming, and because of our work together previously, we know that there are plenty of schools and districts that are using data to the point where they're stymied in their progress because they're overwhelmed with the data. So I think if we just pull back a little bit and ask ourselves, like, what actually is the purpose of schooling?
Mhm.
And what are we trying to achieve with these settings? And I've alluded to this before. Do we want to create a space that's 20th century where students are just learning facts and going home, rote sort of memorization and regurgitation? Or are we creating the spaces with that data to truly support equitable spaces where all voices are heard and the brains of those voices are being utilized in ways that can truly change lives?
Piece that really came out over the past 2.5 years around the pandemic. You know, we talk about mental health, we talk about social emotional support, we talk about all of those, you know, whether we call it wraparound services or non-academic needs, you know, whatever terminology we use. I think we have to honor the fact that you have, you know, again, child, whatever the terminology, I think we do have to honor that. At the same time, you know, we used the word a couple times, define the purpose of school. And if the purpose of school is to ensure that kids learn, if that's the purpose, and I think your school site, your district has to decide what's the purpose, but if that's the purpose, then where do those other pieces fit? How does social emotional learning support learning? How does collective impact support learning? How does leadership support learning? So it's all anchored around learning. And all of those other pieces are support of what the purpose is. And I think until you establish a purpose, in my time at the University of Virginia, that was one of the always really work with districts to identify what's your purpose. Why is there a school? Why is there a district? What's the purpose? So I think that's
So much for your brilliance, your energy, your on all the things that we talked about today. And I just want to honor all the work that you all have done and continue to do to make sure that other people's children can have, you know, 21st century, you know, can have the kind of spaces where parents are affirmed, are welcomed, and where innovation is the driver of the work that we do. So thank you so much.